was it 2011, I think? We had you here in 2011.
For Storm Chasers.
For Storm Chasers, we had discussed Storm Chasers in our book club. And she came and she did a beautiful presentation with slides and pictures of guys chasing tornadoes and all that. And it was awesome. And she's going to talk tonight about Grand Central, which is her new, is it a novella?
It's a novella.
It's considered a novella.
Yeah.
It's a nice story in this original stories of post-war love and reunion. And I have to admit, it's the only one that I read. I didn't read the others. I will.
I won't tell the other girls.
You had it propped up as a you know, enticement on the circulation desk for weeks. So I didn't want to take it home and keep it from people who wanted to come tonight. So Jenna is the author of 3 books, New York Times best-selling author, Those Who Save Us, The Storm Chasers, and now, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's not a quiz. The lucky one. Well done, yeah.
So I'm going to turn it over to Jenna now because I'm losing my ability to speak here. one little thing I just want to ask. Yeah, I can speak in a room with 12 people. I have trouble with cameras. If we could silence phones and electronic devices, if you have a call that you need to take, please gracefully leave the room and do so, because I just want to have my phone set as quiet as possible.
I want that too. I'm like, where's my phone? Oh well. If somebody calls me, it'll be my mom saying, "Are you at the library?" "Yes, I'm at the library. I told you I was going to the library, having cake and everything. Hello." So last time I had pictures of guys storm chasing, and today I just have a bookmark with David Hasselhoff on it that they made me here. This beautiful, because last time I was supposed to come here, it snowed. It was like before our big snowy winter. It was like 3 inches of snow.
It wasn't even.
I know, I'm so sorry to say. It was like a flurry or something, but I am phobic about driving in snow, so it's so good that I live here. And I have a house in Minnesota too, and one winter not too long ago I rolled my Jeep in the snow on some black ice, and after that I had told Pam, if it snows I can't go anywhere, I'm just grounded. So basically I haven't left my house for like 4 months now. And today is the first time I've driven in literally 2 months. So the whole point of this really long anecdote is that I said, well, David Hasselhoff will bring me to the library if necessary on a snowmobile, because he has this ridiculous video of him driving a snowmobile. And luckily that turned out to be not necessary, because I think we've turned a corner and maybe it's finally spring. But meanwhile, I have like this fabulous bookmark, which is going to come with me everywhere I travel. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for having me back, even though I'm clearly like a lunatic. It's great. And thank you all for coming out to hear a writer talk about her writing. We do our writing in an isolation chamber, most of us, even if we're writing in cafes or libraries, which I don't. I write at home, like in yoga pants, in total seclusion. But we're all in sort of our own bubbles, playing with imaginary people who we come to care about very much. And when we come out in public and we see real people, like, first of all, that's a treat. So I'm kind of like, oh, I see real people. Oh my gosh, so amazing. And then when you, by the miraculous telepathy known as reading, know the same people that I made up in my head, that's like a double miracle. And the triple miracle is that you'll come out in the cold on a Monday evening to hear me talk about writing and about these people. So thank you very much for doing that and supporting the library, which is such a great nucleus of a community, always. How many of you have read Grand Central? I know this is going to be like well, actually, that's more hands than I expected, so thank you. It's okay to put it, if you just read like half a story and you just want to put up a finger, that's okay. That's fine. I ask this not to chastise you for not doing your homework, but to give you some idea of what this book is. It is an anthology of novellas, all set in Grand Central Station on the same day in September 1945, a few months after America left the war. So people are coming home from the war, and the station is sort of a nexus of thousands of lives, as it is now. But since it was such a fraught time and an exciting time in American history, a bunch of us World War II girl authors decided to get together and do this anthology. And the background to this is, because people always say, what an interesting idea, how did you come up with this? And I can take no credit for it whatsoever. I was kind of lolling around trying to figure out what book I was going to write next and working on the screenplay for my first book, Those Who Save Us, and I got this message on Facebook from another writer I know named Christina McMorris, who writes a lot of World War II fiction. She has a lot of very popular and best-selling novels out. And she was like, "Hi, honey. I was having drinks with Sarah Geo, who's another World War II best-selling female novelist." She's like, "And we thought it would be a great idea if all of us gals got together and did an anthology. What do you think?" And I was like, "Sure." And that's sort of like, let's do lunch kind of way. Like, that sounds like a great idea, Christina. Totally count me in. That really sounds fabulous. And none of us knew at the time that Christina used to be a wedding planner. So not only is she ruthlessly charming, she's ruthlessly organized. And the next thing we knew, she had gotten 10 of us together on Facebook, all women who write World War II best-selling novels. She had gotten commitments from all of us. She took them to her agent, who took them to her editor, who sold the book to Berkeley Penguin. And then we all had to write these novellas. So we got roped in by this relentlessly charming woman. And I'm so glad that she did this for us, because not only have I gotten to know this incredible group of writers, first on social media and then in person when we launched the book, which we did this summer in Grand Central at a bookstore called Posman's, like this little tiny independent. We got to dress in period costumes, so we all went shopping on ModCloth, which is this 1940s, 1950s rabbit hole that you go into online and you buy all of these clothes and then you pop out again with like fascinators. And so we all had these great costumes for our launch, and of course, because we're in New York, nobody cared. It's like there are 10 women all wearing 1940s clothes and like victory curls in like the middle of the station, like next to the iconic clock, and everybody's walking past like, whatever, I need my bialy. But we had a terrific launch, and with so many women involved with one project, it could so easily have been like Sorority Girls Gone Wrong movie on Lifetime with lots of political infighting and whatever, but it really wasn't. All of the women who contributed to this book care really deeply about their fiction, even though many of them write faster than I do, which is a little bone of contention for me. I'm just jealous of their work ethic. But they care deeply about their fiction, and they all care really deeply about the greatest generation. And I didn't even have an understanding of that depth until I read the whole anthology. And it may make you feel better to know that. I didn't read it until I was on the plane going to the launch. I sent my story in and promptly moved on to other things. And then I thought, perhaps I should read this before I actually get to New York and we launch it. And so I read the whole thing cover to cover. And I thought that the flight attendant would have to give me like a Xanax on the plane, because I found it really moving to read all the stories in succession. They're dedicated to great uncles who died on D-Day, or female flight pilots who ferried domestic airlines within the United States, or one woman dedicated her story to her grandmother who didn't want her husband to come home from the war because their marriage was not so fabulous, and then what happened with that marriage. So all the stories touched me really deeply, and it was so amazing that still, all these years later, in a different century, in a different millennium even, there is a chorus of women who are my age who are all saying, "We remember, we remember, we remember." So I'm honored to be part of that group. And I'm so glad that Christina corralled me into contributing. What I'll do is I will tell you a little bit about my novella, which is called The Lucky One, and then I'll read a little bit of it to introduce it to you, and then I will be happy just to take any questions that you have about anything, or comments, whatever. The Lucky One, which is dedicated to my dad, is set in Grand Central Station, which I found out doing research is called Grand Central Terminal because all the trains end there, and I was scolded for saying Grand Central Station because it's not correct. So it's set in Grand Central Terminal on Thursday, September 20th, 1945, and it's about a young man who has emigrated from Nazi Germany and now lives in Westchester with his very wealthy cousin Saul, who wants him to work in the family law firm. But the young man, Peter, does not want to work in the family law firm. He's working as a waiter at the Oyster Bar in Grand Central Terminal, and sort of dreaming about his lost dreams of becoming a chef. So I will introduce you to Peter and kind of skip around a little bit in here. Okay. Grand Central Terminal, New York, Thursday, September 20th, 1945. It was late September when Peter saw the woman who looked just like his dead mother sitting in the oyster bar near one of the grand architectural columns. She was eating something Peter's mother would never have put in her mouth because it was treif, forbidden, a shrimp salad. Peter quite liked it, as he liked most non-kosher things forbidden by his mother's childhood teachings. He cleared the woman's dining companion's soup bowl, the remains of the restaurant's nominal dish, oyster stew, pooling tepidly in the bottom, and then he stopped, the bus tub held at his waist, and just stared. Despite her consumption of shellfish, this woman had to be Jewish. She was, to use the English idiom for it, a dead ringer for Peter's mother. Salt and pepper hair braided around her head, a rose-colored dress, pearls, a fur stole, although the day outside was quite warm and the air in the oyster bar soupy. The woman's nose was the delicate blade of a fish-boning knife, her exquisitely rushed skin the texture of a peach the day before the fruit rots and its mortal sheath slides off. The term in German was Doppelganger. It means double-goer, one's exact counterpart. And in literature, Peter remembered from his university days, a confrontation with one's doppelganger signified imminent death. But what did this mean, spying not his own ghost, but his mother's? The woman, sensing Peter's stare or his lingering presence next to the table, looked up and over, and Peter saw with deepening shock and fear that the woman even had his mother's eyes, his own eyes, deep-set and blue-green. Peter fully expected this woman to say, "Ach, Petal, your beautiful hair, it's far too long," then to reach over, brush the locks off his forehead, and say to her friend, a corpulent gentleman with black-trimmed glasses, "Did you ever see such golden curls on a boy? A gift from my mother, so wasted on him. Isn't he the lucky one?" And then she would sigh dramatically and smile at Peter with the greatest tenderness. The doppelganger, however, did nothing of the kind. Her face, in first inquiring, tightened into an irritated expression. She looked Peter up and down and seemed on the verge of saying something sharp when her traveling gaze fixed on Peter's left forearm. Peter himself glanced down, although of course he knew what was there. The bus tub had pushed up the sleeve of his white shirt, unbuttoned in the heat of the kitchen, to expose the small, crooked, greenish line of death camp numbers. So I'm going to skip ahead to the next day when Peter is back in the kitchen of the oyster bar and he's just finished eating a hamburger, which the line cooks love to feed him because he's still really thin from being in the camps, so they try and fatten him up. They've kind of adopted him and they stuff him with burgers all day. And the manager, Leo, has just said that he wants Peter to come to his office. Leo spotted Peter in the corner of the kitchen and beckoned to him. "Kid," he said, "come with me." And he led Peter out of the steamy kitchen and through the rear of the restaurant to his tiny office. It was hot in this room, Leo's black wire fan riffling his pinup girl calendar, hiding and revealing Miss September 1945 in an endless game of peekaboo, but doing little to stir the stuffy air. Leo sat on the edge of his desk and looked sadly at Peter, who clasped his hands and fought the urge to stand at attention. He wished he had at least had the chance to remove his apron, stained with ketchup and Thousand Island dressing. Bless you. Bless you. "Kid," Leo said, "I gotta let you go." For a minute, Peter didn't comprehend this. He processed and reprocessed the translation. Let you go? Let go? And all the while, what flashed through his mind was an image of his daughter's hand, Ginger's, not Vivi's, splayed like a star and winking white in the winter sun on the Grunwald freight yard platform in Berlin. "Pardon me," Peter said finally, "I am not sure I understand." Leo gestured at Peter's arm. "It's that," he said. "The customers don't like it. It makes them uneasy." "Ah," said Peter, instantly amending it to "ah." He remembered the way the woman, his mother's doppelganger, had eyed his tattoo yesterday, and he rolled his sleeve down to hide it, the green mark like the bite of a very small animal trap on his skin. "I am sorry, Leo," he said. "I am not yet on shift, but I will be more careful. I will keep my shirt like this, you see?" Leo shook his head. "I wish it were that easy, kid," he said, "but this just isn't the place for you. If it had been only that lady yesterday, but this isn't the first time I've had this complaint. A lot of our customers have said it disturbs their appetite to think of, you know, while they're eating." Peter's ears grew hot, as if Leo had boxed them. He stood, trying to think of what to say. His first impulse was to laugh, to point out to Leo the irony of people being put off their meals by the images of people who had died of starvation. But then he felt very, very tired. How weary he was of all of it, the long faces like the one Leo now wore, the expressions of sympathy, when there was no way anyone who hadn't been there could understand, of the four fingers loop-de-looping the ears to signify Peter's sorry mental state, and of the pity, curiosity, and revulsion. Peter was tired of understanding why Americans were so revolted by him. How well he understood. "I see," he said stiffly to Leo. "I will go now. I will not make more trouble for you." Don't be that way, kid," Leo said. "I'd keep you on if I could, as a cook even, where people wouldn't have to see your arm. But then I'd have to let somebody else go to make room, and who would you want that to be?" Peter shook his head. He took off his dirty apron and rolled it neatly into an oblong, setting it on Leo's desk. "You'll make out all right, kid," Leo said earnestly. "You're a hard worker. I know you're a good cook. And you're one of the lucky ones, right? You survived everything those Nazi momsers threw at you, and more. Puh, puh, puh," he pantomimed, spitting on the carpet. "You'll do good for yourself. I know it. It just can't be here." Peter nodded, and Leo walked him to the door. He put a palm on Peter's shoulder and handed him an envelope. "Take care, kid," he said. So that leaves you kind of in the middle of the story. And if you want, you can read the rest of it to find out what happens to Peter. But the story, when you read the subtitle for this, Pam, the original stories of post-war love and reunion, I kind of had to laugh about that because obviously my story is not exactly about post-war love and reunion. And you're not the only one. My agent, when she sold the book, or when she collaborated with the other agents on the anthology and she read my story, my agent is French and she sounds like a sort of evil James Bond villainess at the best of times, and she was like, "Everybody is going to be so bewildered by this." She was like, "So there are all these nice stories about tiptoeing through the tulip, and then there is your story about this guy who gets fired from his job because of his camp tattoo." She's like, "This is what I expect from you." I'm like, "Thank you." So, but I did have a reader on Amazon who was really sad about that and felt rather hoodwinked and said, "I bought this because I wanted to read romance in the second story. Like, what was that? It was so dark." But I really think there are some of the other stories that are not all tiptoeing through the tulip. And all of them are about love in one way or another. And Peter's story is very much about love of the family that he left behind in Germany, and how one goes on after the loss, such a crushing loss of such a vital core love. So even though it's not necessarily a happy story with, you know, Clark Gable in it, it's still, I think, about love, in some ways, the tragedies of love. So would you like to hear how I came up with this idea? Okay. For once, I actually have a encapsulated sort of answer to this question. I wasn't actually sure I wanted to go back to writing about this era after I wrote my first book, Those Who Save Us, because I spent 10 years writing that book and researching it, and then I got away from it with the second book. And something had happened to me in the interim, like I grew a heart or something, like the Grinch, or like my little tiny heart grew bigger, because when I returned to this era to research what might have happened to Peter's family, I had a really hard time with it. It was really grisly to go back into the Holocaust era. I know, like, poor me, you know, researching it, and I know people who have lived it, but it was tough, and I basically whined and moaned around the house for a long time. I was living, I have been living for the past 3 years in Kansas with my fiance, who is an extreme weather photographer, and I just moved back this winter, which obviously was smart. Because I talk about extreme weather, but I moved to Kansas for love, and then I moved back to New England for the writing, because I miss the writers here so much, and I miss the writing community and the reading community so much here. So here I am in the snow. Anyway, I wrote this in Kansas, and I was sitting at the breakfast table for several days in a row, moaning excessively about how I didn't want to go back to World War II, and this was such a hard thing to do, and I didn't have any ideas. And finally, my fiance said, well, I kind of think you should do it, because it sounds like a really cool project. And I was like, okay, well, yeah, I probably should. And actually, I do have an idea. And I remembered that, and this is how it works. I bitch and moan for a really long time, and then somebody points out the obvious, and I'm like, you're so right, I should do it. So I had the great privilege in the late 90s of interviewing Holocaust survivors for the Steven Spielberg Survivors of the Shoah project, and had never used any of their stories in fiction because they don't belong to me, they belong to the survivors. But I remembered this one story. Every once in a while I'll take like a nugget of a story and blow it up into something else. I remembered this one gentleman who had been a chef in Prague, like a highly celebrated, Todd English level chef, and then got sent to Treblinka, where he survived by digging graves for his fellow inmates, and then was sent to Auschwitz, and then survived those 2 camps and a death march, and then made it to America, was sponsored by the Joint, and ended up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is where I ended up interviewing him. And he was working as a busboy after the war because he wanted to get back into the restaurant business, and he was fired from his job because of his camp tattoo, because it upset the diners. And I never forgot that story. I thought how cruel that indignity was, like the smaller irony of making it all the way to what you thought was a safe place, and then having to confront attitudes of denial and just people not being able to understand what you went through. And I always thought when I was interviewing survivors that, the really meaty part of their story is, of course, what happened to them, and these excruciating stories of loss that we can hardly even imagine. And I think that's what makes those stories so universally and continuously gripping, because we try to put our minds around that loss. Like, how do you survive, first of all? Like, how do you survive in the woods? How do you survive in a camp? How do you do that? There's sort of endless fascination with survival. But there was always that sort of aftermath story of that we kind of skimmed over, not in the interviews, but it wasn't spent as much, we didn't spend as much time on it. How did you get to this country, and how did you manage psychologically when your whole family was gone and you were like 14, 15 years old, 20 years old, 21 years old, and you had lost everybody you knew and lost your profession and lost your dreams? And I mean, now we have a breakup and we're like, you lose a job and it's like the worst thing in the world. They had lost everything and came to a place where they didn't know the language. And I just thought it was a really fascinating thing to explore. So again, once I started working and got over my bad self, I really was happy to have a place to plug this story in. And give it to the anthology so that it would be kind of kept safe here and would be told. So that's where the story idea came from. And Peter's circumstances are all things that I totally made up. His family in Westchester, who sponsors him, is based on my grandparents who lived in Westchester. And their house that they live in is Peter's house that he lives in. So it's been really fun to kind of go back and mine my own experiences, except then I had to tell my aunt, like, oh, I took your childhood home and used it in this story, which is always sort of a casualty. And Peter is based very much on my dad. If my dad had had that set of circumstances, which he didn't. My dad was born in this country in Westchester and became a newsman and was kind of a sort of golden boy prodigy for a long time. But he also was a very gentle soul in a time that didn't reward men being gentle souls. My dad was kind of like Ferdinand the Bull. Do you remember this story? Ferdinand doesn't want to fight, he just wants to smell the flowers. And my dad's dad, my grandfather, who also appears in this story as Saul, was a very generous man and a great philanthropist. Very generous man and philanthropist. And he was also kind of a bully, and he was a self-made lawyer who had a Park Avenue practice, and he had pulled himself up from being a plumber's son to be a lawyer, and you kind of had to swing some elbows to do that when he did, but it resulted in him having some kind of rough edges. So the emotional story for me in what I just read you is what is it like to be a guy who has a milder nature in a world that very much values the guys who throw the elbows, like in 1940, 1950. And for my next book, I'm expanding Peter's story over the second half of the century to see how those definitions of masculinity change and how the definitions of masculine success change. And so the book is going to be told from Peter's point of view, continuing this story. So I know some people have said, like, I want to know what happens to Peter, I have to know, which is very gratifying to me, like, thank you. I'm glad people like him. I'm going to show you what happens to him, and then his second wife gets a part of the book, and then his daughter, who is a hot mess, gets the final third of the book. And they all have their different definitions of what male success is and how it affects their lives. So I'm glad people are nodding a little bit because it's such a new idea still, I think. Is this boring? Like, you know, you're just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall thinking, what am I going to write next? But
talking about it because last time we asked you, you said you didn't talk about your work in progress until they were in the publisher's hands.
Oh, shoot. Did I say that? I just jinxed myself. Yeah. It was a smoke screen. I mean, I did just send pages to my agent, so I kind of feel like it's official. She was just like, where are my pages? You have been bleeping around for like 3 years out in Kansas. I need to see pages from, you know. The book's working title is Successful Man. So she's like, send me the successful man, send me the blah, blah. I'm like, fine. So I sent her some pages. I'm going to send her an outline. But you guys have caught me at the point of writing when I love the project so much that it's like when you're a teenager and you have a new boyfriend like David Hasselhoff and you're like, oh my God, everything pertains to my new boyfriend. So if you said something like, oh my gosh, I just had a car accident on the way to work, I'd be like, oh my God, one of my characters had a car accident too. Isn't that crazy? Let me tell you all about it. So you caught me at a good time to talk about the new project. I'm kind of in love with it, like newly in love with it. Ask me again in a year when I've been working with these people for like a year and they're being balky and I can't get their story right. I'll be like, I don't talk about it until it's published. So, but Christina McMorris, who spearheaded this anthology, obviously did me an enormous favor because she then gave me a key for my third book, which was sort of bedeviling me for a long time, which is probably why I'm like, oh, I can't talk about it. So every once in a while I'd send her a box of chocolates, like whenever I think of it, you know, just to say thank you. Like this is still going for me. That's a big deal for me, so.
But do you feel that the research that you've done already for Those Who Save Us and for this is enough to
I wish. You know, originally Peter abandoned his career as a chef and became a broadcaster because my dad was a broadcaster. And actually, this was a great sort of family reconnection story. When I posted this online, that Grand Central was going to be published, one of my dad's broadcasting friends from like 1950 wrote to me. My dad started out as a mailroom boy at CBS and worked his way up from the mailroom to writing for like Walter Cronkite and Harry Reasoner, and then jumped to the morning shows and wrote for all the networks. So I grew up like a TV brat. Like every time they needed a kid for a segment, they would haul me in and I would do. And I was like, I am so awesome. I was like a total like, you know, social outcast at school, but every once in a while I would get into like a limo and go to New York. So I'm like, this is a good day. Anyway, so this colleague of my dad's wrote to me and he said, did you know that when we started at CBS, we broadcasted out of Grand Central Station? That was CBS's first home. And whenever the trains came in on the track, they would shake the cameras so that the viewers at home would see their pictures shaking because the trains were coming into the station. He said, I saw your dad run across that catwalk more times than I can count, going from the newsroom over to the studio with like the nightly scripts. He was like, your dad was a schwitzer. Like my dad used to like sweat, like running around. And I really wanted to incorporate that into the book and make Peter into a newsman. But then I was like, oh my God, the research was insane because my dad basically had a ringside seat to every major event that happened from 1950 to like 2000. And I was like, this character is now becoming the Forrest Gump of the news world. Like he covers everything. And so I was researching stuff like Watergate and My Lai and Nixon and things that I remembered very well, my parents talking about and my dad talking about especially, but I thought for a book it was just too information heavy. So I demoted Peter back down to be a restaurateur, and now I get to do research on restaurants, which is fun, which is really fun. I used to work in restaurants. I've done a lot of food service because when you want to grow up to be a writer, that's what you do. You wait tables for like years and years and years. And I was a restaurant manager, and I watched Chopped all the time. So, you know, I love food, and I like to write about food. And I think it's a fascinating sort of sharky industry. So to answer your question, not in the slightest. Like, the research I did for the war years it affects the whole book in a way because Peter's life has been twisted at an early age by losing his first wife and children. But the war is a silent partner in this novel, and so what I'm researching now is restaurants, the tennis culture of the 1970s, which I also remember for Peter's wife, who plays a lot of tennis and has an affair with her tennis pro, and which will be fun. I'm researching affairs. I watched a lot of TV about those, and not field research for that one. And his daughter, Elsbeth, gets involved with a photographer in the 80s, and so I have my fiance to poach off for photographic knowledge, but I need to know about the art scene in the 80s, so I'm researching that. And I'm such a research geek. Like, I love this stuff. I'm starting writing the daughter first and going backwards because that's just what's coming to me first. And I spent 2 hours the other night on this great website that allowed me to listen to the clicks of Nikon cameras from 1980 to 1986, because they sound different from what they work with now. So I thought this was great. I'm talking to my fiance on the phone. I'm like, so what did the Nikon sound like that you used the F3 in 1982? He was like, well, it had film, and you had to rewind it, so it was like click, click. I was like, can you spell? How do you spell? Was it like, or was it like? And he was like, like this is the stuff we talk about, which is great. So I'm like, if you remember how to spell, you can send that to me. And meanwhile, I'm going to this website and I hear things like click, 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 you know. And so this is what I do. And now you can see why I actually like to put on normal people clothes and get out of the house and see regular people. But yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. Yeah, I have it, and in my working manuscript, I have it as like VZZZH, VZZH, yeah. So, there you go. And you know somebody will write to me on Amazon and be like, that is not the way they sounded. I have one. Would you like to see it? I will drive it to your apartment. No, don't do that. Thanks, though. Do you guys have questions for me?
Carol Cohen, I just want
Hi,
to say
Carol.
firstly, the reason I didn't read this book is because I was still reading this one.
Oh, thank you, my first baby.
Oh my goodness.
11 soon, thank you.
I don't need a microphone. Actually,
God bless.
I actually listened to a lot of it on CD in the car, and oh my goodness, you're a fabulous writer.
Oh, thank you.
I want to ask you, and it must have been so hard to write about the subject, and I'm just wondering, what made you choose to write in third person? Because you mainly write in third person, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And about the transitions between modern day and going back, like.
Those are great questions, thank you. How many of you have read Those Who Save Us, the first book? Okay, cool.
I know you came to talk about this one.
Oh no, it doesn't matter. I answer any question that you guys have to throw at me, and if I don't know the answers, I make them up because I'm a fiction writer, so you can ask me anything you want, like I'm not shy, so.
While you're at it, your personal reason why you started with World War II.
I will answer that. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say for those of you who haven't read the first book, which is going to be 11 on April 1st, my first baby will be 11 years old. Oh my gosh. So written quite some time ago. It's about a German woman, non-Jewish, during World War II who gets involved with an SS officer to protect herself and her little daughter after she's caught in the act of the resistance. And then the daughter's quest 50 years later in contemporary-ish Minnesota to find out what the mom did, because the mom will never talk about it. And the daughter, who's a German history professor, starts interviewing Germans of the war era to find out what they what they did in their past and during the war years, and then how they're dealing with it, because she can't get any answers from her mom, and that kind of leads her back to the truth about her own life. It took me 5 years to be able to sum up that book in that sort of Reader's Digest condensed chestnut. But the inspiration for Those Who Save Us came to me because my dad was Jewish, although non-practicing, and my mom is, she says, a recovering Lutheran, also not religious, but she's part German and then part Norwegian, and she was really fascinated by her German heritage. So I grew up in a house that was, A, full of books, because my dad was a broadcaster and my mom was a voracious reader. And also, I think if you have any sort of Jewish background, even if your parents aren't religious or one parent isn't religious, you are steeped in an awareness of the Holocaust and the ways it permeates your life, even if you don't have any direct relation to it. So I have no relatives who died during the war that I know of, except for maybe a great aunt who died at Baba Yar, but nobody really knows. But I still, like a lot of little girls who have this half Jewish or Jewish background, used to play this game in my head of would I have survived, and how would I have survived, and who would have saved me. And growing up in like 1970s New Jersey, I had hiding places in my house in case the Nazis came marching up the driveway, which obviously was going to happen, you know. And the difference between me and normal little Jewish or half Jewish girls is I didn't stop playing that game in my head until I wrote Those Who Save Us. And in that way, it was a relief to write, because I had been carrying these survival scenarios and these really grim scenarios and possibilities of stories in my head for so long that to be able to set them down on paper, it really felt like a sort of exorcism for me, as opposed to being something that was more difficult. And it was enhanced by interviewing survivors for the Spielberg Foundation, which I started to do while I was researching the novel, not part of researching the novel, but because I could, and because the novel had led me to them, and because it was such a great privilege to do so. And so even though I didn't use any of those stories in the novel, the emotional voltage of those interviews had to go somewhere. And what would happen after the interviews, I lived in Minneapolis then, as did my mom, who was so interested in this era. I would leave an interview, drive to her house across town, like tell her everything that happened during the interview, and just sort of process it that way. But I still had a lot of I was haunted by those stories, by what happened to people and the choices they made and what they overcame. So again, being able to put that in the sort of basket of the book was helpful. But the book came to me because my mom took me on a trip to Germany in 1993 that I really did not want to go on, because my dad was Jewish, and I was like, why must we go here? Can we not go to like France or Morocco or Canada or Arkansas or anywhere that's not responsible for killing 6 million Jews? But my mom really wanted to see where her ancestors had came from. Her grandparents emigrated from East Germany. So we went over without a plan. We don't speak German. We rented a car. We drove to this little farm town that her people had come from called Walhausen. It was like a wide place in the road that looked like the wide place in the road in Minnesota that they later moved to. And then we just drove around the country trying to soak it in. And my mom is a concert pianist, so she was trying to understand how could this country that had created so many great composers and musicians and artists and writers and thinkers, like this apex of culture, have also been responsible for the Holocaust. So we drove around the country for a month touring and asking this question of ourselves, which, as you can imagine, made us so popular at German restaurants and beer stupas and whatever, because if we didn't speak German, many Germans speak English, so they're all kind of like, Amerikaner. And one day we stayed in Weimar and we visited Buchenwald, which is the concentration camp in the Ettersberg Mountains, close, about 5 kilometers from Weimar. And I was really struck while I was at the camp that I could see the city from the camp. And it was such a cruelty to be so close and yet so far from civilization and safety. And when we were driving back down from the camp, I said to my mom, what would you have done if you had lived in Germany during the war? And I was thinking about, I know what the prisoners probably thought of the people in Weimar, but I didn't know what the people in Weimar thought about the prisoners. Did they know? How much did they know? How much did they let themselves know? And my mom said, I don't know what I would have done if I I would hope I would have been brave enough to help my Jewish friends and neighbors by hiding them or feeding them or getting them out of the country. But if the Nazis caught you, they would kill you. It wasn't a game, and it wasn't hypothetical. They would kill you, and they would kill your children. And if I had you kids to care for, I don't know, honestly, if I would have been brave enough. I can only hope that I would have been brave enough. And that was when that book came to me. It was like this fully fledged moment where the central character, Anna, the German woman, came into my head as this very quiet, she felt like a very independent presence from me, quiet, so obviously not me, a very quiet but insistent presence who demanded that her story be told. And she is an average person who gets caught in very unaverage circumstances and has to make what Holocaust scholars call the choiceless choice. So I wanted to show the effects on her and then the trickle-down effects of what she does on her daughter, which is why I had to write the daughter story too. And to return to one of your questions, that was a real pain in the neck for me. I wrote all of Anna's story in Germany first, which took me 6 months. And then I wrote all of the daughter's story, Trudy's story, second, and it took me 2.5 years. And the reason it took me so long, I know, right? It was long. The reason it took me so long is I didn't have a lot of sympathy for Trudy, because Trudy's whole purpose for being is to follow her mother around and say, what did you do during the war? Can you tell me about the Nazi officer who I remember? I have, she has repressed memories and PTSD, and she's like, how could you have slept with this man? I remember him. Like, tell me what you did. Tell me what you did. And the mom can never talk about it. So I kept wanting to say to Trudy, your mom's not going to talk about it. Get over it. Leave her alone. She went through enough. And so it took me a long time to work Trudy's story around into a position where I could feel comfortable with her. So I finished writing the 2 women's stories, and then they take up about an equal amount of airtime in the book, an equal number of pages, and I basically shuffled the chapters together like a deck of cards, and then went through and smoothed the transitions between the chapters for readers so that some of the words in Anna's last paragraph will be echoed in the first paragraph of Trudy's next, so that hopefully the transitions between time periods aren't really jarring. And I have had readers say, this is so hard. Like, I'm so immersed in Anna's story, I don't want to go back to the present, or vice versa. People are like, thank God you have the modern day sections interspersed, because Anna's story is so intense that I need to come up for some breathing room and go back to Minnesota with all the nice Minnesota people in the cold. So that's why I wrote it that way. And your question about third person is great. I don't really think I have the chops to be a first person writer. I am greatly privileged to work with many super talented novelists at this writing school called Grub Street Writers in Boston, which is pretty much why I moved back to Boston despite our delicious climate. I missed working with these people so much. I've taught at Grub for almost 20 years, and I'm thrilled to say that a lot of my students are having their novels published or have had them published, have outstripped me, are writing many more novels than I am, and share my agent and whatever. But I'm working with a crop right now who about half of them write in the first person. And I think you really have to be able to ventriloquize into another person's voice when you're writing in the first person, and the voice has to be really compelling. Like, think about Holden Caulfield. Like, part of the charm of Catcher in the Rye is that Holden has such a distinct and personable voice. My writing in the third person is a little bit like the reason that I don't act. Like, I can imagine being in somebody else's skin, but I don't throw myself into other people's voices very well. So all of my stories essentially are written in my voice with my syntax and my language, although it shifts a little bit from book to book. But the content of the stories belongs to the characters. Does that make sense?
And doesn't it make it easier to be able to, like, introduce different people?
Yes, it does. First person it offers many joys that I don't get with third person, but first person is also very challenging because you're working with one person's perspective and you don't know what that person looks like always. Like, I'm always seeing writers do things like, I caught sight of my 5'7" lanky frame in the shop window, and I'm like, wah, it's so unnatural way of thinking. So it can be challenging.
Can I just ask one more while you?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. you were talking about those who save us, so, and about inspiration. Had you come across the hiding the rolls in the tree?
In the tree?
Because did you do that while you were in Germany and driving? Or
did I hide rolls?
No.
I'm totally kidding. I'm messing with you. No, I did not hide any rolls. And I actually didn't think about it until I got back to, I wrote Those Who Save Us. I was living in a 2-room apartment on Beacon Hill, and it was festooned with all sorts of memorabilia that terrified people coming to my apartment, because I had books like Who's Who in Nazi Germany and the Buchenwald Report, and people were like, why do you have that? I'm like, why do you want to know? But one of the things I had on my wall was a map of the camp, which was really quite an extensive, I mean, they had a movie theater, they had a brothel, they had a hutch where they bred Angora rabbits, because some of the prisoners would weave like little handicrafts for the SS officers' families. I mean, it was the most bizarre alternate universe imaginable. And I thought how totally, this is the apex of Nazi thinking to me, is how totally bizarre to have all of these civilities and these trappings, not only of normal life, but of like uber civilized life, while these atrocities are going on literally next door. Like they would take young boys off the cattle cars to put in the brothels, you know? So it was kind of like, and then at the same time, all the officers had to be married. They had to have families. They had to have a really good show of family life, and it was mandatory that they participate in orgies too. So it was really this dual thinking that I found really fascinating and really hard to get my mind around. So when I was researching the camp, I saw that it had a quarry in the woods, and my mom and I actually did see the remains of the quarry. When we visited the camp in '93, it was not well preserved because it had just been sort of abandoned by the Soviets when they moved out, and the Soviets had not really preserved that era in history. So Buchenwald at the time was still just a camp that was encircled by barbed wire, and then the medical pits were just these crumbling, you know, pits of tile in the ground that were full of water. There were school children running through the camps, like picking up stones from the barracks and throwing them around. And I mean, it was not a museum yet. It is now. But I remember sort of creeping around in the woods. And actually, the sidebar story to this is my mom and I both got Lyme disease while we were creeping around in the woods, because there was a Lyme epidemic going on in Germany that summer, and we didn't speak German, so we didn't know. So my mom's theory is that some Nazi officers were reincarnated as ticks, and they bit us on the hiney while we were like creeping around in the trees. Yeah, animated Nazi ticks. I'll pitch that. Thank you. I won't even take credit for it. But I remember looking at the remains of the quarry, which was another very large pit, and I stored it away. And when I wrote the story, Anna's paramour gets put into the quarry fairly early on in the book, and she wants to do something to help him, and she's working in a bakery then, and she gets involved with the resistance who leaves bread for the prisoners, and then the prisoners leave messages for the people who deliver the bread so that those couriers can get the messages out to the resistance. And that actually did happen, and it was responsible for the bombing of the camps in 1944 and 1945. The prisoners, because there was of course a photography studio at Buchenwald for taking pictures. And the prisoners would take film, put them in, but they would put them in prophylactics to protect the film, and then they would smuggle them out of the camps in ways you don't want to think about too much, and then they would hide them on the perimeters of the camp, and then the couriers would come and pick them up. So when I was researching this, I actually made up the part about the tree, because I thought, I don't know where they could put them. I never found an interview from the couriers, but I imagined if somebody could get close enough to the perimeter of the camp, and it's really heavily wooded, as I know from my tick experience, that they could have found a hollow tree and left the information there, and a small, wiry prisoner could have gotten to the perimeter and picked up the bread and distributed it. So it had a weird sort of fairy tale element to it too, to leave bread like in a magic tree and to get film from the magic tree. And so far I haven't been called out on it, so hopefully it's a piece of fiction that flies. That's a short answer. I'm so glad you asked that question.
I was really struck by the pretty much taboo subject still of the cruelty that Anna experiences in this country, which has really gathered a lot of interest in the atrocities that both, not just the Russians perpetrated against the German population, but the American soldiers as well. I wondered what you did to prepare for that, if you had either read books such as A Woman in Berlin, or seen the film, or what, now there's a whole lot more on it, but for the longest time, people in Germany could not talk about, particularly the women, the rapes, and what happened to them, the starvation, because as the enemy and the propaganda in this country, and as you've alluded in your other stories, people weren't ready to hear it. They couldn't handle hearing the truth of that. And I'm just kind of wondering, as you're talking, what types of things did you do for your research, or did you try to find?
That's a great question. Did you guys hear the question? Should I repeat? The question is, Anna suffers, the main character in Those Who Save Us suffers, I mean, basically everybody pretty much wants to rape her at some point. So she becomes this officer's mistress, and then when the Americans come in, there's a drunk young soldier who comes into the bakery where she's working and tries to have his way with her. And the women in the town, the German women, are terrified of the Russians because they've heard stories about what the Russians would do if they would get to the town, so they are praying for the Americans to come and not the Russians. And then, I don't know if this is a sort of piggyback to your question, but when Anna comes to America, she marries a GI and she comes to this country. I don't think I'm giving away many spoilers. But nobody rapes her in America, and her husband is actually kind of a nice fellow, but she's ostracized by the community she moves to in Minnesota, and I can talk about that too if you want. So there are sort of two questions. One is, how did you prepare to write about her experience in Germany when the armies came in and were fairly brutal to the surviving women, and then where did I get the research for her ostracization in America? Most of the women that I interviewed for the Shoah Foundation had been raped at one point or another. It was like a common, I would say 80% of the women had been brutalized in this very specific, very intimate way. And most of them wouldn't talk about it because it was generational.
Did you see the movie or read the book?
I didn't see I read the book, A Woman in Berlin, but I didn't see the movie.
One of the questions they asked was not, were you raped, but how often?
Right, it was kind of,
Because
I mean, it sounds awful, but
every woman is going to be raped, but the question was it once?
who did it? And
Yeah, who
which
did it, and
nationality?
how often
And
did it happen?
yeah, it's terrible. I feel as though when I was researching this era, I had the idea that the women were not only a casualty of war, but they were kind of like the spoils of war. And the guys, like a lot of them were these young soldiers. They were full of testosterone. They were drinking. They'd done terrible things. They were, they were not right in their own minds. And so they're let loose upon this population, and they've seen and they've done these incredibly savage things. And then they get to a civilian population, and the women are there, and the women tend to suffer. Did you have it?
I just wanted to make the comment that Stalin actually ordered his soldiers to decimate the Germans. And so they were ordered to go in and rape and pillage and kill the women. That was on purpose.
Yeah, there were a lot of stories about, there weren't a lot of stories or nonfiction narrative or interviews that I could find from German women. Woman in Berlin had not come out yet when I was writing Those Who Save Us, but I read it afterwards.
They just found out who she was about probably 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Before that, it was just written by anonymous.
Anonymous, and yeah,
So
and
she
I
could
had
not
it.
even give her name.
Yeah.
Who she was.
Yeah.
The taboo was so great.
Which kind of speaks to the silence that the women in my interviews kept to, most of them. But I remember I found this one book that was a series of interviews of German women called Frauen, German women recall the Third Reich. And there was a across-the-board feeling among the women that if the Russians came, they were dead. Like, they would bayonet the babies. I mean, I put that verbatim almost in Those Who Save Us, that they were like, please let it not be the Russians, because they'll bayonet the babies, they rape the women, they burn us, they kill us, they whatever. So please let it be the Amis, the Americans. And so that's where I took Anna's experiences from, but then Weimar was liberated by the Americans, and I thought, well, just because a soldier is an American soldier doesn't mean that he is going to be perfectly upright and understanding about everything. And the Americans who came to Weimar liberated Buchenwald, and there were stories from the women who lived near Dachau of the Americans not only forcing the Germans to go to the camp to bury the dead, and this happened at Buchenwald too. The Americans made the Germans walk through the camps to first witness what had happened so that they couldn't say like, oh, we didn't know, we had no idea. They were like, you knew, and now you're gonna look and you're gonna bury. So there's all this archival footage of these fairly well, I mean, they're dilapidated because it's war, but the women still have their hats and their tweeds, you know, they have their children with them and they're walking through the camps looking at these piles of poor dead skeletons and, you know, covering their mouths and faces because the smell was, forgive me, sorry, but the smell was so terrible, and then they would be forced to bury them. So it wasn't that far of a leap in my mind for an American soldier who was far from home, who had been fighting for years and who was drunk and who was, you know, at the end of his tether, to come to the bakery and try to have his way with Anna, and she's saved by another American who eventually becomes her husband. But I will tell you, there are people still who are not happy to hear that, or not willing to hear it, because I did have a reader write to me and say, how dare you dishonor the memory of our soldiers by putting this story in the book, and how dare you? And I said, well, A, it's fiction, but B, I think it's really important that we dispel stereotypes, and I don't think that, you know, American soldiers all awesome and all Germans are bad and all Russians have bayonets. Like, people are people, or people are people, and that's my point.
Perception of a universal disease like PTSD.
Right.
Equal opportunity affliction, and it affects Americans just as much as it does Germans.
Right.
And
That's a great point.
The side effect of PTSD in men is to inflict violence.
Right. That's a terrific.
So it doesn't care if you're American or German.
Right. It's not like
be aware of that.
an evil necessarily.
That's
So
part of our, you know, denial that we need to be aware of and break through.
when I wrote back to this reader, she told me that her uncle had been a soldier who fought through D-Day and survived, and I was like, okay, I get it. I mean, in a lot of ways, and I understand why that would have been hard for her to even imagine, and a lot of times when I do get very personal email from people about Those Who Save Us, it's usually because it has struck a chord with them from their families, and so I take it with a grain of salt. But I often get scolded for the portraits of the rapes in the book and the sort of systematic sexual torture that Anna goes through at the hands of her German mentor, if you will, her German savior. And people are like, why was this necessary? Why did you write about this? You don't have to write about it. It's not nice, like shame on you and whatever. And I just think, well, I feel again that women are so often casualty of war. And if I didn't show the extremely intimate ways in which this woman's psyche was affected, my question to the reader, which is, what would you do in her position, would not be as powerful, because you wouldn't understand exactly what her position was and why she does what she does to her daughter and the kind of very chilly person she becomes. So, are there other questions? Yes.
I have a
Thank you.
lighter question.
Thank God. Thank you. And there's I wish I knew who was going to be in the movie. I have a, and I didn't mean to say, like, thank God, like, your questions weren't great. Your questions are fabulous. So, and I appreciate talking about the deeper stuff too.
Because I'm a retired therapist. What seems extreme and awful to most people, you know, I'm
You're like, yeah, it's work. You know,
that's just
it's a work day.
Test when I hear that most people aren't used to dealing with the realm that I did for 20 years.
Right. I should have guessed. And when people ask me about the lack of quotation marks in this book, in that book, I'm like, are you an English teacher? And they almost always are. So that's kind of cool. So the movie, Those Who Save Us, is under option. I've been working with a producer for about 4 years now. And she just extended her option until May. So actually, now that I think about it, I have a conference call coming up that is a progress report conference call, so we can find out what her team is doing. She is working with her people to, I don't know, whatever producers do, to produce things, to get the finances in shape for the movie, and to attach talent. Like, there's a whole new set of verbs that goes along with movie making that I became aware of when I started writing the screenplay. And I wrote the screenplay not this past summer, but the summer before that, because this woman was kind enough to invite me to do it. Like, she sent me a screenplay for Those Who Save Us that she had attempted, and I read it and I was like, that's not exactly what I had in mind. So we had one of these conversations where women disagree, where they're like, oh, it's not? No, not really. Okay, well, maybe I could take a crack at it. And you're like touching each other on the arm. Really? Okay, yeah, why don't you? So I asked her if I could, get a crack at writing the screenplay, and then it took a year for our entertainment lawyers to line up my contract. I mean, it's just this ridiculous sort of Byzantine thing, but meanwhile, I taught myself how to write screenplays, which I had never wanted to do and never intended to do. It's an entirely different skill from writing a novel, where you get to be the autocrat in your own world and make all the decisions about everything from the character arcs to the settings to the placement of the commas to the lack of quotation marks. With a screenplay, it's a collaborative project and you have to play well with other people, which I never have done particularly well. And the irony of it is that with the novel, I spent so much time, like 412 pages worth of time and 10 years tinkering with it to make sure that every detail was carefully calibrated to produce pictures in my readers' minds, right? So with the screenplay, you strip out all of that lovely detail and you just include the plot and the dialogue. And I had this software called Final Draft where you type in, exterior, New Heidelberg, 1996, and it formats it for you so that it actually looks like a script. And I was like, oh my God, I'm a screenwriter, oh my God, this is so exciting. And my fiance, who actually has done some screenwriting and has sold some scripts, was like, yeah, I mean, he would kind of read over my shoulder and be like, you can't put that Anna glances meaningfully into the corner. That's a director's decision. I'm like, but it's important. And he's like, no, it has to go. Wah, I'm like, you can't put that, her eyes suddenly become darker. I'm like, but I can. He's like, that's the actor's job. I'm like, oh. So I basically shrinky-dinked my 400-page opus into a 120-page screenplay and sent it off and collaborated with the producer on subsequent drafts. And it was great to learn how to do this. And I did this by reading books that had been adapted into films, reading the screenplays of those adaptations, and then watching the film with the screenplay on my lap to see how the project morphed from one stage to the next. And it was, in almost every case, the book was radically transformed, especially the endings. So I will say that my producer totally wants to change the ending for Those Who Save Us, and I refused to do it in another way when I was like, no, I'm not going to. But you can, but I won't, because I'm not going to eat my young. Like, I can't. I mean, to me, the ending of Those Who Save Us, which I won't talk about, but for spoiler purposes, but it is the point of the book, to me, in many ways. And I said, if you change it, and give it the Hollywood ending or like the Lifetime ending, then go ahead, but just don't tell me because I don't want to know. And I can tell you probably there are about 1 million readers out there who are really not going to be too happy about that. So, but that's your decision. Okay. So then we moved on to more fun things like talk of casting. And originally I wanted Alec Baldwin to play the Obersturmführer on his Nazi lover, but like that was 12 years ago, and he was like young, wolfy, sardonic, evil Alec Baldwin, and now he's like Mr. 30 Rock Alec Baldwin with a young yoga instructor wife. So we were trying to figure out who else we could get, and my producer is thinking maybe John Hamm would be a good Obersturmführer, and she asked me to make Trudy 50-something instead of 60-something so that we could have, or 40-something instead of 50-something, so we were looking at Cate Blanchett and, oh my God, my mind just totally went blank. Charlize Theron, and I love Diane Lane. I always wanted Diane Lane, but she might be a little older. And we were headhunting people for Anna in Europe because there's nobody really who looks like Anna in this country. To give you some idea, Ingrid Bergman would be the ideal Anna. Just very soft and strong and kind of sturdy, but a lot of the actors today are too waif-like. So, but then it was really funny, like I had sent my producer, we crossed emails one day, I was like, what about Jennifer Lawrence would be a great Anna? But then she won for Best Actress, and so we're like, oh, forget it, her price tag just went up too much. Or like Emma Stone. No, no. So I mean, we were thinking like the whole thing with Gone with the Wind is that great search for Scarlet, right? When like all went to Europe and then they chose Vivien Leigh, who was a British actress. So my producer is looking at a lot of French actors and a lot of German actors for Anna. There were some good places.
That did A Woman from Berlin.
Okay.
She is tall and she's a little heavy set. She's got
That's
dark
good.
blonde hair.
Okay.
And she looks very
Which they can
German.
change. It's the face, you know. It's
She's
like
a
you want
very
that.
good actress.
I will
mean,
look. Thank you.
You could almost like not even have the subtitles on, and just by her expressions,
Cool.
you know, she has that Judi Dench / Meryl Streep
Cool.
expression.
Well, that's great because everybody wants Meryl Streep to be the older Anna.
Her eyes,
So,
like
still.
Judi Dench, she has those very expressive eyes.
Yeah.
where You don't even need to understand what's being said. You can just tell by looking at her face.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll watch it.
When you were writing the screenplay, what about the scenes in the camps and stuff, like
Well,
the Milk movie?
actually, in Those Who Save Us, I never went into the camps.
No, but I mean some of the, like outside the camps when they witness things and.
I think they would recreate it. My producer did a location scouting expedition in Weimar, so into the camp, and they would shoot it in Germany. There's a lot of tax incentive to shoot in European countries too, apparently. So she's wanted to do most of the European shooting on location. And then she was asking me about going to Minnesota to do location scout with me because I have a family house in Minnesota in the town New Heidelberg, which is not actually New Heidelberg, it's called Caledonia. And it's where my mom and my grandma grew up. So I was like, you can stay at my house and we'll just drive around and check out the town and the people. And people in this town love me because, you know, it's a tiny town. It's a farm town. Nobody ever goes there because why? It's a farm town. And then I come to town and they're like, the writer is here. Oh my God, what is she doing now? Like some weird thing. And I'm always importing other weird writers and doing peculiar things like digging my garden up with a spade. And they're like, why don't you use a rototiller? I'm like, I don't know, what's a rototiller? You know, so I'm always entertaining them and I hope to bring them some film people. That would be great. It would be such a culture clash. We can make a movie about that.
In one of our many emails over the past few months, you had mentioned going to Berlin for the German launch of Those Who Save Us after years and years and having it translated into many languages and launched in many countries. Did that happen?
No, I so wanted to go to Berlin, and my mom is so angry at me that I didn't get to go to Berlin for the launch. But what happened was Those Who Save Us was sold in like every single European country ever, including Luxembourg, which like people don't even remember is a country. But my agent could not sell it in Germany. She tried for 10 years to sell it. And she's ruthless, and she's the head of foreign rights for her agency. So every year she'd go to the Frankfurt Book Fair and try to sell the book. And she kept getting the response, why is an American woman writing about Nazi Germany? And then finally, she sold it to this publisher called Aufbau Verlag, and they retitled it Die uns leben, Those Who Love Us, which is nice, but they kept the cover with the little girl on it. And it came out in February, and I was like, so do I get to go to the launch? That would be fabulous, and bring my mom, because my mom came with me to Germany on all my research trips, and my mom is like, I would like to go back to Germany before I am too old to even remember it. And I'm like, oh, okay, so we'll go. And but the publisher said, why don't we get some traction on the book first so that if we pay to import you to come over here and send you to bookstores, there'll be more people than you and your mom, which totally makes sense. And I relayed that to my mom, and she got it because when the book first came out in America and I did my author tour, that was who came to my my readings all across America. It was like me and my mom and like a homeless person who came in to get out of the cold, you know. And so we became used to very small audiences, and it was fine, you know. I mean, if anybody shows up, I will capture you and read to you for like 2 hours and talk at you about my books, but it's a little harder with a European tour where they're putting money behind you.
Is it selling?
My mom just asked me that yesterday. She called me and she was like, it would be interesting to know how many copies you have sold. I'm like, I don't think that they can tell me that until at least April because it just came out in February. So they have to go a quarter before they can get the sales figures. But I was actually a little bit scared at the thought of going to Germany to talk to German audiences about that book because the subject is obviously extremely charged. I did go to Holland a couple of times to talk about Those Who Save Us because it was a huge bestseller in Holland, and I was really a little bewildered by it, although incredibly grateful, like on my knees grateful, literally. I have an amazing publisher there called De Boekerij, and the Europeans treat their writers like rock stars. I mean, like here you might see like a Dean Koontz novel on a billboard in like Rye or like Westchester or something close to New York, but like rarely anywhere else. But in Holland, all the book billboards are like everywhere, and I came out of Schiphol Airport with my publicist, and she's like, "Look, your book is on a billboard," and I'm like, "Oh my God, is that a billboard?" I had jet lag, and she was like, "I have to spend 4 days with this woman. This is terrible." But they had set up this great author tour and a lot of Q&As in various regions in Holland and on boats, and I mean, it was just this fabulous thing. I had like this hat with like orange feathers because I was like, "I'm in Holland. It's a Dutch color, yay!" And what it turned out was that so many people in Holland remembered the war, and their parents and grandparents were in the resistance. And that was why the book struck such an incredible chord with people there, and they sort of picked it up and ran with it. There it's called The Family Portrait, Het Family Portrait. And it was the best-selling book of 2011 there, which I just thought was amazing. I mean, I literally was on my knees praying, in gratitude about that. And I have one of the billboards. I asked my publisher to send it to me, and I was still living in Kansas. I was like, if you guys are going to get rid of these billboards, can you send me one? Because I really want one. So she sends me this billboard. It's like a tube, like as long as like from me to this camera. And I was like, yay, my ego is like so huge. It's like billboard-sized ego. And you unroll this thing, and it says, the best-selling book of 2011 with the cover, and it's all in Dutch. And I'm like, this is so cool. So I took it to a framer, and he was like, what is this? I was like, it's my giant ego. It's a billboard, it's my book cover. And he was like, okay. Like in Kansas, they had never seen anything remotely like this. They're like, book? Like a book? A what? So he framed it for me, and then it was windy, and I almost died trying to get home because it like took me away like a kite. And I still haven't figured out how to ship it here, so it may stay in Kansas. Anyway, I don't even remember what your question was. I'm sorry, you guys are too much fun. I'm just like babbling. I don't even know what time it is. You have to hit the gong.
A quick question. Do you do book plate signing at all? You know how sometimes the reason is I bought a copy of Grand Central in December, in anticipation of your appearance in December, because
No, sorry.
I bought
Snow.
it for my boyfriend's, my son's girlfriend, and they are carrying on a long-distance relationship at graduate schools that are about 500 miles apart. So I thought the theme of sort of reunion,
Oh, yeah.
I thought it really, so I had the whole thing, and I was going to explain, you were going to write a personalized inscription
Aww.
for her, but then you couldn't show up because of your snow phobia, which I really understand. But I had to give it to Maddie anyway. I gave it to her with the story, but not the inscription. So I'm wondering whether you do.
I do. Normally I have postcards that I use because so many people read on Kindles now, and I like to sign a postcard anyway so that you can have it. But then I went and checked my postcard cupboard, and it was bare. It was like Mother Hubbard's cupboard. It was like there were no postcards. But I have a business card, and you can always write to me on my website or on Facebook or on Twitter, and I will happily mail you one as soon as the postcards come in, which is like a month. But I just ordered them on Vistaprint, so they'll be here in like a month, and I'll send them to you in May, so please remind me. And please visit me at my website. This is my commercial my agent makes me do. It's jennablum.com, and then I'm on Facebook all the time, like posting about David Hasselhoff and the library. And what's that? Shut up. My mother watches this all the time, and she didn't even tell me. But yeah, come find me on Facebook. I like to make friends and procrastinate, and it's a delight. Thank you. My dog, my black lab, also has his own Facebook page, Woodrow the Storm Chasing Lab, wherein he comments on the foibles of humans, from everything from storm chasing to just like existing. I mean, everything we do is like perplexing to Woodrow, including today taking him to like the car dealership to get a new tire. He was like, WTF, really? Yeah, so, and I have a running battle right now with autocorrect that I'm putting on Facebook, because my autocorrect on my phone not only has a mind of its own as everybody's autocorrect does, but it doesn't even, it makes up words. So like the other day I was texting to somebody, and it was like, hi, Mufti, and I'm like, that's not even a word. Or like my thing where I tried to tell somebody that her photo was wonderful, and it changed it to Winderfic, and I was like, that is not even a word, autocorrect. Really?
And you get an answer back from the person, and they say, what the heck?
What the heck is Winderfic? Like, what is that? And then, but my most damning one recently, which I haven't posted yet, but I will at some point, but it was so embarrassing, is that I do a lot of public speaking, and this lady wrote to me to ask if I would speak at their fundraiser. So I was writing back, and my autocorrect is not just on my phone, it's on my computer, and I don't know how to get it off. So when I make a typo, or when autocorrect gets one of its little brainstorms, it changes the words for me while I'm typing, and if I don't have time to proofread, bad things happen, which happened here, because this woman said, will you come and speak for us? And I wrote back, and apparently autocorrect accepted her invitation and said, I would be delighted to come and spew for you. So I won't be speaking for them. Or spewing, for that matter. So, yeah. So anyway, that's what I'm up to on Facebook these days. When I'm not writing my books, I'm posting my autocorrect battle. And on that note, I would be happy to spew for you guys, or sign books, or whatever you like. And maybe I'll go sit over there and sign things if you want me to.
Did you bring?
Does anybody else have a final question, comment, anything that we need to wrap up before she sits and does some signing? Go ahead.
I do, just, it's kind of a shameless plug, I guess, to
Awesome.
request. Just hearing you speak tonight and hearing that you've heard so many survival stories and whatnot. My grandmother, my family's German, and I grew up, I relate to Minnesota, I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and
Oh, yeah.
close to Wisconsin.
Cherry country.
Exactly. And we have a lot of German and Scandinavian population up that way. And I read a ton of historical fiction. I've always been fascinated about Holocaust stories and whatnot. So I just hope that you keep more books coming, because I think of all the books I've written, I just love your style of writing. And
Thank you.
I did not want Those Who Save Us to end. I just want to keep reading. So
Thank
that's a
you.
little request to keep them.
Thank you. That was a wonderful way I did not even pay her to say that. So that was like, there could be no better ending to a talk than that. Thank you so much. That was really kind of you. Thank you. It's kind of you to listen to me spew. Thank you. Thank you.